Well, what's the goal of revising history? Why do it?
Well, we revise history all the time, and we should. I'm not trying to stop anyone carrying out historical investigations, far from it. I say in the book, I'm not against historical revisionism. I think the revisionists need to be revised in turn because I think they've had too fast and full a run. I'm not against understanding any of this in the round. What I'm against is trying to understand it through a very narrow ideological lens. And here's the thing. I mean, if we'd have been born like 50 years earlier than we were, we would almost certainly have had an education in the UK where there would have been a map on the schoolroom wall of the globe and the great pink of the British Empire. And we'd have been brought out to say, good God, what a great amount of the earth we own. Isn't that terrific? And we're a tiny country below. Now we've got all of that. That's just grand. And the teacher would have told us about these great heroic people who went out and made this possible. Now, that was not history in the round. That was a very narrow, ideological view of empire. Well, unfortunately, it's also a narrow and highly ideological view of empire to do what we're currently doing, which is to say you must only look at empire by, for instance, equating it with the worst actions of the Third Reich. You know, you can only compare it with Nazism. You can't say, well, it's a complex thing. Some benefits for some countries, a lot of negatives for a lot of countries. And the only people who tried to add any context and make any of the necessary corrections to the overreach have been just destroyed. People like Professor Nigel Biggar from Oxford University, in the wake of the Cecil Rhodes affair at Oxford, when there was an attempt to pull down this statue of an undoubted colonialist, Cecil Rhodes, who also endowed his former college at Oxford, Oriel, as an attempt to pull down his statue. And this professor at Oxford, Regius Professor at Oxford in ethics, Nigel Biggar, a very fine man, objects to this and says, why don't we, since we're a university, we shouldn't allow these lies to be told about Cecil Rhodes, which is what people were doing. They were making up quotes of things he'd said, when what he'd said was quite bad enough. But they invented quotes and said he'd used the N-word in contexts he had and all that sort of thing. And Nigel Biggar, this professor, said, why don't we try to set up a course at Oxford where we study the ethics of empire in the round? You know, try to work out a moral calculus, as it were, of what it meant. Now, that would be a really good and reasonable project. He wasn't allowed to do it. Fellow academics by the hundreds denounced him. How can you even think of trying to put this into context, they all said. And one of the main arguments they used repeatedly was you can't excuse empire, because to excuse empire would be to excuse, for instance, the Amritsar massacre, which was the time when British troops opened fire on an unarmed crowd of protesters in Amritsar in India, not to be confused with the time when Indira Gandhi ordered the massacre of far more Indians on the same spot. Those two things are not to be confused at all. But the time when the British opened fire, and Winston Churchill in the House of Commons denounces it as one of the greatest crimes of the era. He says it's a great stain on the British Empire that such a thing should have happened, and it was. And Colonel Dyer, who ordered the soldiers to open fire on this unarmed crowd, he was put into retirement immediately. You might say worse should have happened to him, but that's what happened. And there was an incredible outcry. Now, some hundreds of people were killed at Amritsar. But again, is it impossible to work out what the benefits were for certain countries of British presence? Is it wrong to think that Hong Kong benefited from British presence, or Singapore, where societies which have flourished, or did flourish in the case of Hong Kong until quite recently, is it wrong to try to work out why the places succeeded, and why the places that failed, and what went right and what went wrong, and whether you could find a ledger? That seems to me to be a very good, reasonable enterprise.